Boa tarde a todos. Meu nome é Vitor, a gente está dando início à nossa última conferência do nosso evento de mitologia nórdica. Estamos trazendo hoje o professor Declan Taggart com uma proposta de conferência intitulada Old Gods' Minds, What Would an Old Norse Deity Know Anyway? Portanto, a palestra do professor Declan será conduzida inteiramente em inglês. Após a exposição das ideias, nós teremos um tempo para um pequeno debate, possíveis perguntas, então sintam-se livres para escreverem suas perguntas nos comentários, se possível em inglês. E, introduzindo o professor brevemente, o professor Declan Taggart possui um bacharelado em literatura inglesa pela Universidade de Durham, mestrado em estudos medievais pela Universidade de York, doutorado em filosofia da língua inglesa pela Universidade de Aberdeen, e estará começando um novo doutorado na Universidade da Islândia, em que ele estudará as relações entre moralidade e a religião nórdica antiga. Declan também é autor do livro How Thor Lost His Thunder, The Changing Faces of an Old Norse God, publicado pela Routledge. E, enfim, agora a gente vai pegar um tempinho só para apresentar o professor para a nossa audiência internacional, como se trata de uma palestra em inglês. So, good afternoon to you all. My name is Victor. We are now proceeding to the last conference from our digital event on Norse mythology. And today we are presenting here Professor Declan Taggart with a conference which brings a very intriguing title that is Old Gods' Minds. What would an Old Norse deity know anyway? Professor Declan Taggart has a bachelor's degree in English literature from the University of Durham, a master's degree in medieval studies from the University of York, a PhD in philosophy in English from the University of Aberdeen, and he's now starting a new postdoc at the University of Iceland, in which he's going to study the relations between morality and Old Norse religion. Declan Taggart is also the author of the book How Thor Lost His Thunder, The Changing Faces of an Old Norse God, published by Routledge. We're going to have now Declan's presentation, and at the end, we're going to have time for a little debate and some possible questions from the audience. Mr. Declan, thank you for accepting our invitation and for being here with us with this very curious topic. So please, feel free and take our time to let us know what you have come up with. Thank you.
Obrigado, Victor. Boa tarde. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that big introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining me in what's a very rainy Northern Ireland right now for another in this fantastic series of papers. I hope I can do justice to the presentations that have come so far, even if I can't give it in Spanish or Portuguese. But I have to admit, I'm very excited to present this material to you. This is the first presentation I've given during the pandemic. It's the first I've ever given virtually. And it's probably the last presentation I'll give in this material. This is going to be like a summing up of work that I spent my time in Cork doing. And it's also going to present some material that still isn't published, but hopefully will be very soon. So I want to talk to you about this question. Were Old Norse gods omniscient? By which I mean, if you stopped the early Icelander, Egil Skallagrimsson, in the street outside right now, and if you were lucky enough that he didn't chop your head off for the impudence, if you quizzed Egil, would he tell you that he believed his gods could see him wherever he was? They could hear him pray wherever he prayed. They would read runes that he wrote on a stone, even if he threw it into the sea. Would they know everything Egil did, regardless of where he did it. And just as importantly for me, regardless of what Egil told you, would he act in a way that presumed the Old Norse gods were omniscient? Omniscience here I will refer to as superknowledge, and occasionally as superperception. Partly because these terms are less loaded with Abrahamic theology and with scholarly history, and partly because they better describe the phenomena that I was investigating. Superknowledge kind of means possessing greater knowledge than a human would be expected to have. And that's normally, practically speaking, what we actually encounter in religions across the world. Instead of gods that are truly omniscient, that know everything, we encounter gods who know a lot more than humans do. And I should note that I'm interested in a few sub-questions as well. If the Old Norse gods were given superknowledge by their worshippers, what impact did this have on the religion as a whole? And did the idea of superknowledge vary? Did some gods have it? Did other supernatural creatures not have it or have it? And was it given differently in different circumstances? To examine these questions, I'm going to apply theories from the cognitive science of religion. The cognitive science of religion is a field of study that began in the 90s, really, the 1990s. And it kind of takes from a lot of different disciplines. There's some cognitive science, obviously, but there's also psychology, even evolutionary science, anthropology. And at its heart, it's the pursuit of how religious materials and practices are generated and shared just through the ordinary workings of the mind. I'm also going to say the word agent quite a lot. I think agent is a really useful catch-all term. It basically means any entity with real or perceived intentionality. So an agent could be an animal, it could be a god, it could be a dead person or a spirit or a human. It's anything that we give sentience to. We believe has sentience, at least. And I'm also going to use the word religion a lot to refer to the traditions associated with Old Norse gods. I realize this can be quite controversial, but I'll be using it here today because it is very useful and provides a common basis for understanding, especially when we're talking about behaviors and practices that exist cross-culturally. To begin with, I'd like everyone to call to mind their own conceptions of the Old Norse gods. Think of the Old Norse gods. What are you thinking of? You might think of Freya shaking the hall in her anger in the poem Hringsfjira. You might think of Freya riding her chariots that are pulled by cats. You probably think of Thor and his hammer fighting a giant serpent. Or Odin wandering the world, kind of dressed up a bit like Gandalf maybe, and punishing anyone who's not clever enough to beat him at riddles. I might be wrong, but I'm imagining for most of you, if not all of you, that the Old Norse gods are anthropomorphic, very people-like. They're physical beings. They get old. They eat. They drink. They can even die. Yesterday's paper on divine landscapes by Dr. Carl Edlund Anderson covered many of these aspects of their mythic lives, actually. They live very human-like lives in the mythology. And they're not necessarily the kinds of beings in that mythology that you would expect to be able to monitor humans unless they were near enough to actually see things happen. On the question of whether or not Old Norse gods were omniscient, Ben Raffield, Neil Price, and Mark Collard have published some of their thoughts in a paper that I think is fantastic. It's a very good paper called Religious Belief and Cooperation. And they come to this conclusion, more or less. Effectively, they think that the Old Norse conceptualization of supernatural monitoring, of superperception and superknowledge, they think it was very limited. Instead of being omniscient, the Norse gods had the ability and desire to wander the physical world. And this means they could have been personally monitoring an individual at any given time. And I think this fits in with the general consensus of opinion for the last century, probably more, on Old Norse gods and their awareness of the world and their lack of omniscience. Because in the Old Norse material that survives, we don't have actually many really obvious depictions of non-anthropomorphic gods. They are very human-like, that's fair. I would like to propose that there are good reasons for why we have this conception of the Old Norse gods and why other conceptions, if they existed, may not have survived. At this point, I'm not saying those conceptions did exist, just that it would be unlikely that non-human-like gods would have survived very often in the materials we have. The first problem is the sources that we have. I don't think it will be a surprise to many of you when I say that Old Norse scholars have to overcome a source problem, much like historians in most fields. The majority of the sources we have on religion come either from many years after a region's conversion to Christianity, or from contemporary historians or ethnographers who were followers of another religion and were often using Old Norse religion as part of propaganda, really. If the material has not been retained by Christians, then often our material has actually been created by them. So that's a very hostile transmission environment. And it's not an environment in which we would expect to find depictions of Old Norse gods who could rival the Abrahamic god in terms of power. This, for me, is a good quote on the kind of selective pressure that Christianity exercised on the sources that remain. This comes from an 11th century account of an ethnographer called Adam of Bremen. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. And he's describing this scene at a ritual place in Uppsala, in Sweden. He says, the incantations customarily chanted in the ritual of a sacrifice of this kind are manifold and unseemly. Therefore, it is better to keep silence about them. And you can see how this attitude would mean that academics today have little literature regarding rituals, nothing we can be sure is a prayer, and even less of exegesis or anything like complex heretical ideas about the powers of pre-Christian gods, anything that would make the pre-Christian gods seem more impressive than the Christian god. Even if intellectuals like Adam weren't actively trying to expunge such ideas, why would they seek to retain them? They don't have any reason to do so. In this paper, I'll be trying to mitigate this problem by mixing later sources, such as Eddic poetry, the sagas, with sources that are more likely, at least, to be contemporaneous, such as skaldic poetry or runic inscriptions. But even those early texts are problematic for our purposes. A runic inscription, for example, isn't somewhere you would expect to find a lengthy discussion of theology. It would take too long to carve it into the stone. Just isn't appropriate. Right here. So the kinds of information we have are limited by the media in which they're transmitted. Even if we consider, for example, in the Psalms, the Old Testament God is often very anthropomorphic, lives in a mountain, hears prayers, sees people acting, has, in other words, a physical body. Why should we expect Old Norse poetry to be any different from this early Abrahamic poetry? My second problem concerns the difficulty of transmitting complex ideas in oral media. Not only are some media inappropriate for discussing what we might call Old Norse theology, such complex ideas are also difficult to pass on. Cognitive science of religion has debated this for the last 20 years more. And there's some problems with the conclusions they've reached. But I think we can safely say that when we communicate ideas, simple ideas, such as the idea of a human-like God, They're much easier to explain and pass on and remember than complex theological ideas, such as the idea of a God who doesn't have any eyes, but is still aware of what's happening, for example, alongside a whole host of other similarly complex ideas. That our sources are so fragmentary and scrappy in the information they convey, that makes the situation even worse. And a human-like God is actually also much easier to make the basis of a story than a God who isn't human-like. So there's a whole raft of reasons there for why human-like gods might be preserved. Even if Old Norse worshippers believed in gods with super knowledge, it's not likely, given all of these problems, that we would find them very frequently in the sources we have. So many factors count against them, that type of information being retained. And so that's why I think this is an area worth examining in greater depth to see what we can find. The first thing I think it's important to acknowledge is that worshippers can hold multiple contradictory ideas of a god simultaneously. So even if we have these anthropomorphic, human-like gods, that doesn't have to be the only version of the gods that exists in the mind of a worshipper. It's just the type of image that was used in the creation of mythology. To demonstrate this, I'm going to very briefly talk about a theory from cognitive science of religion called theological correctness. And theological correctness emerged from experiments conducted in the 90s. These studies found that when adults in India and the United States were asked about their gods, they described beings that existed without physical or spatial properties, who were able to know and do everything at once, and didn't need sensory input to acquire information. So basically, they described gods that were omniscient, omnipotent, and so on, when they were asked directly. And that's important. They were asked directly, this is what happened. However, after the participants in these studies were told a few narratives about the same gods, these participants remembered the gods from the narratives as being limited in their ability to pay attention to different things happening, and being fallible in terms of their senses, and didn't know everything, and as having a single location in time and space. So when we're talking about narratives, these gods suddenly remembered as fallible, and especially as needing to see and hear in order to add to their information. So there's a split there. These people are holding two different representations or ideas of their deities almost simultaneously. There's one idea that they profess when they're asked about it, and another idea that's generated when they aren't asked and when they aren't consciously trying to articulate the beliefs they have in their gods. And that split is quite persuasive, that you can have anthropomorphism coexisting with less anthropomorphic ideas. It's persuasive because it's visible in so many religions across the world. This is an easy example. We return to the Christian God, who knows all things at one point in the Bible, but at another point in the Bible has to go down to earth to see and experience things, to know about them. It's a God who rests, who sees, smells, has a physical location, and in general leads a very human-like existence. So whatever else we might say about theological correctness and the studies they did, the basic finding is quite persuasive. Worshippers of gods can have multiple ideas about their gods, even when they contradict each other. In Old Norse mythology, we have one of the types of images of gods they found in the studies. We have the human-like gods. What we're missing, generally speaking, is the other, more theological idea of gods. And with this in mind, I'd like to move on to talk about theory of mind, which is the other main theory of interest for me. Theory of mind, basically, is the position that humans, and maybe also other animals, assign mental states, so intentions, desires, knowledge, and so on, to other humans, as well as to animals, inanimate objects, and even natural phenomena, like the wind, the sea, and so on. And we use this projected mind to understand the agent, the animal, the human, or so on. I've seen quite a few good examples of this. A very good one for me is, put yourself in this situation. You've got a deadline, and you're desperately trying to print something out for the deadline, but your computer refuses. If you're anything like me, you immediately start to suspect that your computer not only has a mind, but that your computer is out to get you. It planned this. And sometimes maybe you promise revenge on your computer for the terrible things that it's doing to you. And we do that even though we know rationally that a computer doesn't have feelings, a computer doesn't plan, a computer doesn't have a mind. It can't make any decisions for itself. That's theory of mind. We're giving the computer a mind. And we can actually see this developing in young children. If you've ever been on the phone with a very young child, maybe you've noticed that the child will talk as if you're in the room. They'll talk about the teddy bear they're holding or some game that they're playing, for example. And that's a sign of theory of mind that hasn't developed yet. Young children haven't reached the point of understanding that other people don't know, that other people don't see or know the things they do. In the study of religion, theory of mind is important for a host of reasons. But one of the big reasons is that humans also attribute mental states to supernatural agents, including gods, demons, and the dead. And crucially, the minds attributed to gods and those other supernatural agents are not the same as human minds. Actually, we tend to give supernatural agents much greater knowledge of the world than we would to other humans. There's quite a few classic experiments that have been conducted to show this, but the gist is that from a very young age, people begin to learn that their parents don't know everything, that their parents can be fooled, but they still believe that supernatural creatures of various types cannot be fooled. They give super knowledge to supernatural agents. A big nuance in this is that different supernatural agents can have different limits on their super knowledge. So one study of this, conducted by Nicola Knight, found a big difference in Mayan children who believed that the Catholic God had the most super knowledge, and that local agents, the sun and the masters of the forest, would have less knowledge, while a final group, which were called bogeymen in the study, they were as limited as humans. So theory of mind attribution, the giving of super knowledge, can develop differently for different supernatural creatures. Many supernatural agents are given this super knowledge, however, but not consistently. And so we might expect that super knowledge varies for different supernatural creatures who come from early Scandinavia and Iceland in the minds of early Icelanders and Scandinavians. With this all ticking over in the background, I think it's interesting to look at Old Norse culture and see what kinds of supernatural agents did exist there, and whether any of them were perceived as beings with this extended knowledge of the world. The first thing I have to do is emphasize again that anthropomorphism is hugely important in the material we have. I'm not going to try to deny that. If anthropomorphism, human-like behavior, is the dominant mode of mythology. Gods act just as humans do. They don't tend to be limited in exactly the same way humans are. Their age might be arrested, for example. They might eat and drink as humans do, but eat and drink something very different. But generally, the features of a god are rationalized or tend to be extensions of the kind of capacities that humans have. If we look specifically at Odin, A lot of Odin's myths depict him seeking out knowledge in the world. So if Odin is super knowledgeable, if he has this omniscient capacity, you would think that would contradict the idea of him having to go out to search for knowledge. That can't work, surely. Super knowledge and somebody having to search for knowledge, it's a contradiction. But as you'd expect, or all of this buildup would be for nothing, I think we can find evidence for super knowledge in Old Norse religion and its various manifestations. I would split this kind of evidence into two categories. Sometimes these categories blend into one another, and the connection between them, I think, is actually very interesting. But the first type concerns direct communication with supernatural agents, and the second one would be mythological motifs. The first set of materials, those concerning direct communication, they survive in accounts of varying reliability, as well as in places like material culture. The most interesting to me are the fragments of praise poems that directly address Thor in the second person. And this addressing of a god in the second person is a phenomenon otherwise unknown in the material that exists. There's a few stanzas of poetry of this type that survive, and they may actually have been once parts of prayers, although as they stand, these stanzas lack many of the features that we would normally assume a prayer should have according to comparisons with other cultures. There's no language of petition, for example. There's no self-examination. And as you can see, the content is very anthropomorphic. Thor's basically just beating people up. But he's also supposedly listening to this poem somehow. We also have this really interesting stanza that's supposedly by Egil Skallagrimsson. We get in this stanza, or the half stanza that I have here, we get Egil addressing the gods in general. Freyr and Njörður here, as well as a deity called the Landás, who might be Thor, but I think more plausibly a deity associated with a specific part of the land in Norway. So the Landás for me might be an official deity of the region, for example. And the poet here is trying to persuade these gods to punish Eiríkur Bloodaxe, for crimes against him and against society in general. I've quoted the second half of the stanza here, as I say. Freyr and Njörður make the people oppressor flee from his lands. Lo, the harmer of the praiseworthy, Landás, that one who damages cult places. And there's so much in this text to analyze. It's dense with possibilities. But instead, I'll just point to the way the gods' names are used here. The gods are used in this consistent, kind of this like lovely invocatory quality to the text. And the naming for the gods in this way might have been intended to acknowledge the gods or as markers of respect, or it could have been seen as necessary to name the gods to get their attention. I would say we have to be careful here. If we look at a Catholic Mass or Catholic prayer, you frequently get the names of Jesus, Mary, the Holy Spirit, or any of the saints being used. But I think it's still interesting, despite that comparison, the way that the gods' names are used here. And this is something we'll come back to later. And the most important factor to note, of course, is that like the Thor poetry, this is an act of direct communication. So there's an implicit need for the gods to hear this poem wherever their poem is being spoken. And there's an expectation as well that Thor, Freyr and Njörður, the Landás, will want to hear this stanza too. I think it's important to say that we have very little idea of when these poems were originally written. Or not written, sorry, composed. And not only in the sense of their authenticity. We might wonder if these verses were supposed to be spoken in places that were sacred to the gods. So places the gods were supposed to inhabit, and so maybe they didn't need super knowledge. There's a scholar now working in Denmark called Benjamin Perzicki, who has done several really interesting studies comparing Christian beliefs with those related to Tuvan spirit masters in Siberia. And they make a really thought-provoking comparison to Old Norse material. The Christians in Siberia attributed their god super knowledge over a very wide area, while the spirit masters were seen as less powerful the farther an action took place from their cairns, from the area they were supposed to inhabit in the landscape. In Old Norse literature, we get a lot of supernatural agents who are connected with mounds, with hills, with farms, or with other features in the landscapes. Not just gods, but many of them are. Eyal mentions, of course, the Landhaus, who might be a regional being. And, of course, we get so many theophoric place names. Odin's Oak Grove, Thor's Island, Frigg's Arable Land. There's so many place names like this across the Scandinavian landscape. So maybe there's a element of guardianship here, and a sense that beings were less aware of, maybe less interested in, acts that were committed further away from places sacred to them. With the gods, that is problematic, because there's so many theophoric place names related to them in the landscape. But it's definitely still a possibility, and especially with more obscure supernatural agents, such as the Landvættir, for example. We might also question if super knowledge is really going to be necessary in situations like that on the slide right now. Again, we've returned to the temple, I suppose the temple in Uppsala in Sweden, in which Adam of Bremen reports that if plague and famine threaten, a libation is poured to the idol of Thor. If war, to Wotan. If marriages are to be celebrated, to Frigga. If this was supposedly a secret place, maybe the gods are supposedly there already, or working through their idols. We will have at least one parallel to that in Old Norse literature that survives. However, we do also get reports of sacrifices and prayers performed outside sacred places. As we arguably see in this slightly cheesy picture in this slide right now, Ahmad ibn Fadlan observes a funeral amongst the Rus on the Volga trade route, in which it's explicitly performed with the expectation that a god is watching and will intervene to bear the dead person away. We also have Dudo of Saint Quentin in France, who reports sacrifices to Thor in Normandy, with the hope of altering the wind. And we have other reports as well, not all of which are as ethnographic as that of Adam of Bremen, but still might be indirectly related to reality. This fantastic episode of a character named Thorhattar, who's very hungry, in Erik Saga Rauda, who's staring skywards with his mouth, nostrils, and eyes wide open, scratching and pinching himself and mumbling something. He's composing a poem about Thor here, whom he describes as his guardian. And this is a very fantastical episode. He's stranded in this island, and it's clear that this isn't any kind of secret place. While it is fantastic, it's not impossible, based on this and based on the kinds of prayer-like poems we covered earlier, that prayers might have been composed and performed anywhere for a god, even if this particular incident is made up. More reliably, we have runic inscriptions. We have, for example, this incredible inscription from Ribe, which it comes from before the Viking Age, and it's on the fragment of a skull. It says, Ulfar and Odin high tur. Uri is help against this pain, and the dwarf is overcome. Or. And it's a bit difficult to make out what this means, but it's definitely an attempt to make a direct connection with supernatural agents. And we get other similar inscriptions that are direct acts of communication on stones and pieces of jewelry found across the north. Runes can also be inscribed on difficult to see places, such as on the back of a brooch. And we even get cryptic runes that are difficult for humans to make out immediately. On this runestone, for example, we can see quite a long inscription in memory of a brother, which takes up most of the runestone. But there's actually some runes running across the top as well. One of those damaged lines, the damage coming down from the top. what are the lines running across? It has like waves almost on it. And those are actually runes that have been worked into the iconography. And they say, Thor Vigrunar, may Thor bless these runes. And presumably that's written with the expectation that not only will Thor see those runes, but he'll be able to understand them, even though they're supposedly hidden. So in my view, this material describes attempts to communicate with gods being made throughout Scandinavia and probably anywhere the Vikings went. There's an assumption that a god would be able to see a worshipper writing those runes, hear that poetry, see human action in general. It doesn't necessarily rationalize it either. It's not even particularly conscious, many of these acts, I would say. There's no need for mechanisms working out of how these communication acts got to the gods. The gods know. I think this means that the Old Norse gods are on the same level, at least, as the gods from the main theory of mind surveys I mentioned earlier, the sun and the masters of the forest. There are two communication acts I would like to look at in slightly more depth. The first concerns runic inscriptions to the dead, and the other concerns knowing names. Obviously, a dead person is not the same as a god, not in every single way, but both are supernatural agents, and the dead are given minds that have this extended theory of mind. They are given minds at least, even if they shouldn't have it, just as the gods are. Basically, I think dead minds in people's perceptions are a bit like God's minds. And so maybe we can, by looking at this comparison, understand a little bit more about supernatural creatures and the perceptions of them in general. And again, runes, I think, are the best source on these beliefs. We can look at this stone from Gurlev in Denmark, which is another memorial stone. And among other things, it says, Nyt vel kumbult, so enjoy the grave well. And there are similar inscriptions from Denmark, or from Scandinavia in this time period. This isn't unique at all. It might actually be a kind of zombie prevention measure, essentially inviting the corpse to stay under the earth. It would explain why the inscription also contains some apparently magical language. It contains the Futhark alphabet and the words Thistle, Mistle, Kistle. Even if this is not a zombie prevention measure, this still is a record of direct communication with a dead person, this Odin-car, even though the body is under the ground, presumably, and isn't in direct sight of the inscription, almost certainly. The dead body no longer has the faculties of a human. It doesn't even have less faculties than a human. Dying, in the perception of the people around, dying has transformed this dead person ontologically into an agent with greater than human capacities of perception. It may be that the name Odin-car is significant here, the Odin part of the name. It maybe should clue us into understanding Odin-car as a special person, socially or in the religion. And as such, maybe Odin-car was expected to be more powerful than other people would be in death. That's some speculation there, but we can compare with texts like Eyrbyggja Saga or evidence for how some ancestors are supposed to be more powerful than others, as to at least back the idea up a little bit. I'd like to think back as well to the previous discussion of how some supernatural agents might have had greater powers of perception in a vicinity, closer to farms or mounds, for example. It's worth pointing out that in Iceland, burials were often associated with farms and were often on elevated ground, as were the supposed halls of the elite dead in stories, as well as creatures, quite slightly more mysterious creatures like Barður Snæfellsás. Obviously, there's other reasons why farms and a mound might be associated, not least to do with land rights and prestige. But it still seems like the dead could have been positioned close to farms, or farms positioned close to pre-existing mounds, because the dead were perceived as more strongly felt to be looking after the farm that way, and especially living relatives. Regarding this stone that I have up here, it's unfortunate we don't know what the relationship is between the dead person's body and the stone. We didn't discover this stone in situ. It could be that Odinkar's grave was closely related to the stone, and as such the runes seen as more powerful for being closer, or that they were widely separated, and as such more super knowledge was given to Odinkar. We don't know much about that relationship. So there's a lot of material there that I think is very thought-provoking, even though it doesn't necessarily provide many concrete answers. But I would still say there's some kind of obscure mechanism at play here, and in which it doesn't necessarily need the dead person to read the runes physically, to be physically close to them, to understand them, and to know they're there. There's clearly an extended theory of mind. And in this context, it's interesting to take it slightly further. If we look at how the dead are very widely associated with knowledge in literature. Dead people in literature have actually become, in Old Norse literature, have actually become a kind of resource. They're called on by other figures when they need to know something. Odin, in particular, is very associated with the dead, which maybe fits with his characterization as a god who's constantly searching for knowledge. He talks to the dead in separate places. He has runes with which he reanimates the dead, such as in this first quote, which apparently can bring back a hangman so they can have a bit of a chat. Odin even seems to die himself, or maybe he just gets quite close to dying. But either way, that brings this influx of knowledge that he didn't have before. Other dead people are also shown as super knowledgeable, and so too are people who've just traveled through the world of the dead. This second quote on the slide offers the giant Vafthrûdnir's travels as a rationale for him being so intelligent. So I think it's clear that in some text, there is a conceptualization of the dead as super knowledgeable, and is even more so than the gods. Partially, this is a narrative prop. It pushes the stories forward. But I do think we're starting to see here early Icelanders and Scandinavians who had a sense of the dead as able to watch over them alongside their gods, and that this sense is becoming elaborated, worked into mythological ideas. It's kind of like the extended theory of mind has become a little seed for a mythological trope. I'd like now to turn to Noah names. This is another kind of elaboration, I think, on the automatic assumption that gods have some kind of super perception. Noah names are found in many cultures. They're by names, names that are used instead of a being's real name if that being is dangerous or very holy. And they're supposed to be used to avoid drawing a being's attention. At its core, of course, this presumes that the being has some kind of super knowledge. Christians and Jews use words like Lord or Adonai to avoid pronouncing the biblical name of the god. My favorite example is actually the second one on the slide, which I'm sure many people recognize from Harry Potter, in which the villain Voldemort is called by expressions like "he who must not be named," or "you know who," just in case someone overhears his name being pronounced. In more recent Scandinavia, Noah names are still a thing. Maybe you yourself know some really interesting names that I haven't heard, but this tradition seems most strong in northern marine traditions. And there are many Swedish Noah names connected with thunder and the beings that bring it. Swedes might still say something like "go for åka" when they see thunder, so the good driver or father drives. Supernatural creatures that might have early medieval roots also receive this kind of treatment, the Tomte and the Nisse, for example. And if we go back to what we're really interested in here, to Old Norse culture, There are some hints that supernatural agents had no names as well. The names Freyr and Freya seem to have meant Lord and Lady, and that might imply these are terms of respect, used to avoid unnecessarily drawing these gods' attention in case they became angry. Freya has a bunch of names, quite a few names, actually, and that supports this further. And so do Thor. Thor has a lot of names, and Odin famously has the most. He has the most names. There's also a lot of poetic and runic evidence that power was accorded to names in this culture quite widely. Heroes and rune carvers tend to hide their names. And there's one episode from Vatnsdæla Saga, which I think is fascinating. There's some Finns who are attempting to achieve super knowledge. They're attempting to send their minds out into the world, and they have to be shut away, and their names aren't allowed to be used. Their hidden names are kept secret, just in case the super knowledge doesn't work. There's a strange connection going on there. I think that the likelihood that divine names like Freya were Noah names, that's upheld by a kind of more general cultural tendency to use Noah names, especially for threatening and possibly supernatural agents, such as spirits, wolves, and bears. There are multiple Noah words for wolf. For example, you get Vari, thief. That also Dengroa, the grey, Gulfot, goldfoot. And some of these animal names certainly have their origins way back in time, and possibly in pre-Christian religion. This has been studied a little bit by scholars like John Lindo and Stephen Dlasecki, but it's definitely an area in which I personally would love to see more research done. I think it's very difficult to do it, but I'd be very enthusiastic about it. Given that the extant sources of Old Norse mythology and culture that we have probably only represent a small fraction of the stories, the concepts that once existed, even at the... Oh dear. Sorry, I shouldn't be connected. Little phone call for you. Given that the extant sources of Old Norse mythology and legend must have represented only a small fraction of the material it once did, it's possible that there were far more Noah names at one point. We should maybe expect more to have existed. And this does recall for me, again, the stanza from Ale Skallagrimsson earlier, which I brought up earlier. It's possible there was an assumption that a magical or divine being could hear you wherever you were. But they wouldn't hear you unless you drew their attention somewhere. So they have super knowledge, but at the same time, there's a weird idea of them being fallible. Perhaps that's reading too much into the use of Noah names, but the implications of calling out a name were clearly something that at least some in Old Norse culture were alive to, given how Noah names are built on in mythology. We have 3 different reports of Thor suddenly appearing when he's called on by other gods, even though in each of these accounts, he is far away beating up giants when he's called on. I should say, of course, that none of these accounts are verifiably pre-Christian. 2 of them, in fact, come from Snorri's work. In 2 of these 3 stories, the wording is very similar. They both say something like, but when the gods got tired of his excesses, they used the name Thor. Immediately Thor came into the hall. He had the hammer Mjolnir up in the air, and he was utterly enraged. So this quote isn't just interesting because Thor appears able to find out what's happening and to appear in a way that defies his anthropomorphism, although I think that's obviously a good start. It's also interesting because it says that the god's name, Thor, is called out to get his attention, even though he's far away. The third of my three examples comes from Lokasenna, the poem Lokasenna. There, Thor's appearance might be responding to an insult given to his wife, or he might be responding to the first use of his name in the poem. He's not called on directly there, but still, it's very interesting that naming occurs. Somehow the god hears it, even though he's far away, and he arrives. It's difficult to separate literary devices from the conceptualization of the gods outside of literature being used within it. But it seems like there's a hint here, at least, towards super perceiving gods. Now, to close out all of this evidence, I'll look at a few mythic motifs that seem to rationalize. They seem to be a rationalization again, this elaboration of a sense of the gods watching. In very few cases do descriptions survive in any kind of wording that can definitely be traced back to an actual worshipper, Odin or Thor. But there's a kind of consistency running through these motifs and how they conceptualize their gods that I'd like to show you. The first motif is probably the most famous one. It's Odin's chair, Hlidskjalf. And this might not be Hlidskjalf on this slide. There's a good chance it is. But in either case, this is a very beautiful, dinky little thing, which I'm happy to show you. When we do find Hlidskjalf in mythological texts, usually there's a formula that accompanies it. And that runs something like this. Odin og Frigg sátu í Hlidskjalf og sá heima alla. Odin and Frigg sat in Hlidskjalf and saw into all the worlds. And I'd like to break this down a little. The first thing to say is that the super perception given by the chair is perceived as kind of sight. They use the word sjá, meaning to see. With the preposition and alla, there's a sense of totality and comprehensiveness in the statement as well. Odin and Frigg can see into all of the Heimar. So the sight they have doesn't have many limits on it. And Heimar is actually one of the most intriguing of these terms. It's normally translated as region or even world. But the crucial thing to note about Heimar is that it seems to denote some kind of habitation whenever it's used. Some place where other agents exist. So Odin and Frigg are looking into places where things are happening, where people and gods and whoever are doing things that are newsworthy, things that are noteworthy to them. Tolkien, in his Lord of the Rings, takes up the motif of Hlidskjalf with this seat of seeing. The seat of seeing is a high seat and it rests on top of 4 pillars on top of a hill called Amon Hen. And Amon Hen means hilli in one of Tolkien's languages. And I think that might actually not be too dissimilar from how Hlidskjalf was believed to work in the landscape. This is where I'm at my most speculative, but it fits in really well with the conceptualization of the mythic and human landscape set out by Dr. Edlund Andersen yesterday. When we think of early Scandinavians in their landscape, we might think of them looking up at the summits of mountains. Mountains called Goðaborg, Goðatindur, Helgafell, so holy mountains, God's mountains. And we might imagine them, how they envision their gods living up there, looking down from chairs inside these halls. Hence, why else would they call them Goðaborg, Goðatindur? The 12 mountains in Sweden are actually etymologically linked with the name of the chair, Hlidskjalf. The skjalf element there is the same as 12. Martin Helgi Sigurdsson has done work on this, although I don't think he's published on it. But I think this is these are very interesting possibilities. As far as Hlidskjalf itself goes, there are a number of factors to keep in mind. Again, the gods are fallible. They have to use a tool to get their super knowledge. Their awareness is limited to when they're on the chair, even though then it can be total. This is the idea of height, possibly. They're interested in information about other agents, and there's the implication of sight. And maybe, therefore, because they're seeing, they don't get information about people's internal representations. They don't know what people are thinking because they're seeing. And maybe they also can't, for example, see through walls. We don't really know. We've never seen Hlidskjalf. We don't see Hlidskjalf used in the material in enough detail to actually figure out how comprehensively conceptualized it was. But in this last regard, it is worth comparing it with the mythological poem Grímnismál, which is kind of a compendium of mythic lore. Odin has a vision in that poem. His vision ranges out across the world, and he describes it as something that he sees as well. So again, there's a connection with Hlíðskjálf there. Odin is also linked with two ravens, Hugin and Munin, and it might be that we can see these ravens depicted on the sides of this Hlíðskjálf-like chair. The typical description of the ravens runs as follows. Two ravens sit on his shoulders and speak into his ears all the news, tíðindi, that they see or hear. They are called Hugin and Munin. He sends them out at dawn to fly over all the world, and they return at dinner time. From that, he knows about many events. For this, men call him the Raven God. So again, Odin is using a proxy, tools, to get his information. Although here, their names might mean thought and memory. So it's possible early audiences actually explicitly thought of Odin as sending a part of his brain, sending a part of his own mind out into the world. Either way, there are limitations here. Odin only gets the information that the birds see. They only fly out for a certain period of time every day. And the birds only report tíðindi, so something like newsworthy events again. Odin's knowledge is conceived as fundamentally fallible. But nevertheless, if we read this passage, we also have the passage is much more concerned with the comprehensiveness of Odin's knowledge, rather than the lack of it. It emphasizes the great area the birds cover and the reliability of them flying out into the world. And in this case, again, we have a definite implication of height. We could turn to a lot of other examples from Old Norse literature. The god Heimdall, very obviously, most famously has great vision. He also lives at Himinbjöll, heaven cliffs, which implies somewhere high up. There's quite a few supernatural females, especially, who have some kind of super knowledge, often alongside some kind of foresight, which is also the case with Heimdall. It's the case for Frigg, a Valkyrie called Sigdriva, giantesses, such as those in the poem Grötusungur, and especially seeresses. So seeresses can be a group that are either human or supernatural. And the material in seeresses is very useful. It's nice and it's explicit in a way that not much Old Norse literature is about how something supernatural works. The clairvoyance was described beautifully in the literature where it occurs. There are a lot of common features as well between accounts of these women, to the extent that it is basically a literary trope. Their superperception is very often a kind of sight. It's very comprehensive and reliable. It's comprehensive and reliable despite the fact that often seeresses are depicted very negatively. Even in that case, their prophecies and clairvoyance is always true. Seeresses often also work from elevated platforms, again from somewhere up high. And so, even though many of these sources are very late, there's common features that occur again and again and again in cultural ideas of superknowledge. Typically, we get superknowledge conceived of in relation to height, in terms of an interest in social information, and in terms of sight. At some degree, the superknowledge is always fallible, although it can be fallible in different ways. They can be limited in terms of how much is surveyed, whether a god's attention can be gotten, and whether the agents only have an interest in certain types of information. Given the level of consistency in these portrayals and the number of attestations of superknowledge in material that was probably pre-Christian, in the poetry, the runes, and so on, I would suggest that there is a long-lasting conceptualization of superknowledge and superperception, and that it continues to be productive in a literary way, at least, well into Christian times. And that's really the beginning of my conclusions. I'm going to try to draw everything together now by returning to the questions I asked at the start of this paper. Did Old Norse worshippers believe their gods possessed super knowledge and super perception? Or did they at least act in a way that implied they had this belief? And if so, so what? What does it matter? Does this help us understand the religion more generally? And also, was there any kind of consistency to how it was all depicted? I think the evidence of those final mythic conceits, plus the evidence of the direct communication we covered earlier, that all suggests that Old Norse worshippers did attribute super knowledge to their gods. They felt they could directly communicate with gods that would be able to hear them and see them wherever they were, regardless of the form of that communication. I also think that this became the basis for a set of quite consistent mythological motifs in which super knowledge becomes related to sight, being up high, and an interest in certain kinds of social information. And this is a kind of elaboration. The sense of being watched by supernatural agents is turned into these more reflective, more conscious, more mythological motifs. And I think it's worth pointing out that the elaboration is along lines that fit the tone and themes of Old Norse literature. I mentioned before Odin and super knowledge. Odin can't have super knowledge if he's supposed to be the god that's constantly searching for knowledge. And so his means of getting knowledge reflect that. The means of his achieving super knowledge reflect that. He has to use tools to know things. He has to use the dead people, birds, or his chair. Thor's super knowledge is only relevant, it only gets mentioned when it's directly related to his mythological role of saving people. So the elaboration of super knowledge into mythology depends on the characters involved. It depends on the texts, the narrative and the cultural world around them. The omniscience of a Christian god in some texts, that wouldn't fit in the Old Norse narrative world, even if it comes from the same automatic, subconscious sense of being watched by these supernatural creatures. And as I've said, there's actually a lot of consistency in the ways in which extended theory of mind is conceived in this culture. And maybe we should take that as evidence of how complex ideas actually can survive in oral cultures, bubbling away underneath, giving stimulus to other ideas and surviving that way. Nevertheless, there could have been variation in the levels of knowledge given to different supernatural creatures, as the case was in the Mayan study looked at earlier. I focused on the gods and the dead here. We have a lot less information for other groups. What about dwarves, for example, Dverga? What kind of super knowledge would they have? Would they have any? Given that this is an oral tradition, I still doubt that there were firm cultural, canonical ideas of super knowledge. We could probably expect much more variation in the explicit conceptualization of a god's awareness of the world. And I would like to suggest that super knowledge does have explanatory value for us modern researchers looking at Old Norse religion. It's important that we acknowledge the possibility that the Old Norse gods were perceived of as having omniscient-like powers on occasion, even if it still remains a possibility. I think it helps us understand Old Norse mythology and religious behavior and how they're generated by the worshippers of those gods and the traditions, the Christians working in that tradition later. Given that there is a relationship between the sense of being watched and the way narratives are created, and also perhaps in the way, for example, the dead were positioned. Really, it helps us understand the stories better, the context of the stories, and so on. Mythology isn't a direct expression of religious thought. It isn't always directly related to ritual, for example. But myth and other aspects of religion can be related. And hopefully this idea of Old Norse gods, super knowledge, speaks to that relationship as we sit around reconstructing it, building and improving our models of Old Norse mythology and religion. Old Norse myths are the culmination of lots of different impulses. Poetic impulses, personal, cultural. They get elaborated out, joined into each other, and create a kind of mythical ecology of ideas. The motif of Odin's chair, for example, twists and entangles superknowledge into something that's in keeping with that god's characterization, with the arc of mythic history as a whole, and with the tone of the texts. And from a pan-religious perspective, the material shows as well that the basic fundamentals of religions can be similar across traditions, regardless of how, for example, culturally evolved a religion might be in a particular scholar's eyes. Many of the impulses behind the creation of Abrahamic religious behavior and literature, for example, might be the same as those behind the Old Norse tradition as well. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and conclude.
Okay, Declan, thank you very much for your original and astonishing lecture. We now are going to open for questions coming from the audience. And we are starting with a question by Leandro Vilar. He asked the following. In the poem Trimsky Vida, Mjolnir is stolen, but none of the gods managed to locate it, only Loki. In this myth, would we have an example which showed the gods' lack of omniscience, choosing to highlight Loki's cunning? Or could it be a kind of satire on this inability on the gods' parts?
I think that's a very good point. I would say, first of all, that I think it's unlikely that something like superman knowledge is related to all the parts of mythology that we have. As I said, it's just one of the impulses going into it. So I think I'm probably more in the first of those two possibilities that were suggested by the questioner. Trimsky Vida, also, of course, we have to think about its origins and how much of a satire it is. We don't know who created it, really. There are obviously some famous Old Norse composers have been suggested as the writers or as the composer of Trimsky Vida, but it could very well be a Christian text, in which case, again, we're unlikely to have intentional depictions of Old Norse super knowledge, even from a satirical point of view, arriving there. Or maybe. I think it's a very good question, and I think I'm more likely to arrive just at a point of view in which it just wasn't relevant. A lot of the time when I'm dealing with ideas of super knowledge, for example, relevance is very important. If an idea is relevant, then it will appear. And if it's not relevant, something else will come in its place instead. And I think that's probably what's happening here. Lovely question.
Okay, thank you. I have a question of my own,
Cool.
And it's regarding anthropomorphic gods. So if we think about Thor, for example, the sources are somehow even clear in picturing him as an anthropomorphic god.
Yep.
But if we take a look at some mythologies from the Finno-Ugric neighbors, like Ukko, the Finnish thunder god, and Horagalis, the Sami thunder god, like was proposed by Untosalo, it looks like these gods were at first thunderbirds and not anthropomorphic gods. And this would have changed in answer to Indo-European changes brought by Indo-European peoples in contact with Finno-Ugric peoples. My question is, when we look at these kind of questions, using the cognitive science of religion, until what point can we talk about and can we consider these heritages, like Indo-European family, Indo-European or Finno-Ugric conception of an anthropomorphic thunder god or no, and etc. Until what point does this make sense?
I mean, I think that it just becomes more and more difficult the further we go back. As with most of the materials, that as historians, the less information we have, it becomes difficult to apply any theory to it. Really, the comparison is a lovely one. The idea of comparing it to the Finno-Ugric materials, for example, even though it's not something I can speak on myself, I suppose I would say you can look, for example, at the name Thor itself. We don't know if Thor is the original name of this. I mean, we know Thor is not the original name of this god, but going back into Indo-European times, we don't know if its Indo-European cognate is the original name of the god. If we can even speak of original names of a god who has passed over so much geography and so much time, for example. Thor itself might be a Noah name, but it is a name that means thunder. It's a name that is not inherently any more. It's less anthropomorphic, for example, than the Thunderbirds example. So I think there's still bits and pieces of evidence that we can pick out and still compare to the theories that we're using. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, you did. Sure. Thank you. We have a question from Pablo Miranda, and it's about the formula. I'm sorry for my Icelandic. Mistil, pistil, mistil, kistil. This formula. I don't know if the pronunciation is right. I'm sorry. His question,
sorry.
Yeah. This formula is usually translated as thistle, mistletoe, casket. It's associated with other gods. In my mind, the best example is that of the Og 181 stone on Thorgold. This stone, Lodbergs, bears the name of another very well-known and popular figure in the world of ancient Nordic religion. Regardless of which god is referred to in the runic text, wouldn't there be a relationship in the lost sense of this formula, since it is cryptic, and the act of invoking the name of these gods instead of being linked to a specific god?
Could you repeat the last part of that question? So I didn't quite catch the last sentence, I think.
Let me see. Regardless of which gods referred to in the runic text, wouldn't there be a relationship in the lost sense of this formula, since it is cryptic, and the act of invoking the name of these gods instead of being linked to a specific god?
So a relationship between... I haven't completely understood, I think, I'm afraid. It's my fault. I think it's very difficult to talk about this formula to begin with, because even if we can translate it, which I'm not sure we can't do completely, I think one of the words is kistel, is the casket, supposed casket, is the most problematic. But even if we translate it, we have very little sense of what that has to do, as with so much runic cryptic language. So much runic cryptic language is just one symbol, or a supposed, like, especially in the early Germanic material, we have just these series of sounds that are completely untranslatable. So I think using that in this way is quite difficult. And I don't necessarily see, I mean, I would love to see a relationship between this formula and a direct communication with gods in some way. I'm not sure I can, but I think maybe I would really appreciate it if the questioner was able to email me or contact me some way, because I'd like to hear more about what he said and to properly answer his question, I think, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me see if we have more questions. Okay, we have a question by João Doia. Is there a god in the Nordic pantheon who has omniscience besides Odin? Does this super knowledge make it possible for any god to predict the future?
Does it make it possible for any god to predict the future?
Yeah.
That's a very interesting question. I guess I would say that the idea of there's two parts to the idea of omniscience here. You have the mythological idea, and you have the kind of evidences that I've separated into direct communication. So with direct communication, I would say that all the gods have this ability to hear prayers or poetry that's spoken to them, for example. Mythologically, I would say the kind of super knowledge that's given to Odin through his chair is very rarely encountered with other deities, with the exception of Heimdallr, obviously. He's the one that's most likely, especially in the descriptions we get in Snorri, but also in Grimnismal. He has this incredible sight and even this incredible hearing, which only appears in Snorri. And he also has foresight too, which is a curious kind of, as the questioner mentioned, that's a curious addition to his abilities. In general, male gods aren't attributed this foresight, but we do get these strange kinds of mentions of female gods, and more generally females, who have the ability to see into the future. And I think that's probably part of the kind of male-focused, it's impossible to get away from implications of patriarchy in terms of who's writing or who's composing this literature and who's the dominant consumer of this literature, and where that positions females in terms of the things they know and the things they share and the things they don't share, and the kind of alienation of the female in that. So yes, there are other beings, supernatural creatures with omniscience, even in mythology, and even foresight. And the ways in which that's positioned relative to the audience is probably the most interesting aspect of that for me.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry if I'm speaking extremely quickly now. I hadn't, when I was reading out my paper, I was trying to go slowly, but then now that I'm back in the natural mode of speech, I've gone back to
I don't
Northern
think
Irish.
so. It is good to follow.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I'm having no problems at all. I don't think the audience is having to.
Okay.
Don't worry.
I'll bear it in mind if there's any more questions.
And we have, we're proceeding to the last question by Rafael Silva.
Cool.
Can we think the act of calling the gods through bynames as a way to specifically invoke them in only one of their mythological roles? For example, calling Odin as the Wanderer, so as not to call the attention of Odin the Terrible One, for example.
That's not an idea I've encountered very clearly in Old Norse mythology. We have the gods who we have got Odin, for example, has so many names. I can't remember how many it is. 60, 70 names we can reliably attribute to Odin, some ridiculously high number. And they do point to different aspects of his personality. At the same time, I don't know if I've seen the names used, or at least a good study of this, in which the names are used to describe kind of different aspects of the god that in a way that you might recognize from other Near Eastern religions, for example. But I hadn't considered that. And I'm not going to look at it in more depth, but because I have other things to do. But I think it's a really good question now that I'm sitting here in this chair thinking about it. I think if you went through the poems kind of systematically, examining where the names are used, the kind of context of it, I think you'd probably find interesting answers. I personally, I haven't seen the gods split up in that way. That kind of like aspects of gods appearing, whereas when the other ones aren't relevant. But I think that's a really good question. Again, great quality questions.
Yeah. So in this case, I have one more of my own, and I am really curious about it. It's about the concept of otherness.
otherness.
So if we think about the context in which Scandinavians were aware of the existence of Sami's gods, for example, we do not have any proof that they denied the existence of these other people's gods, like Sami's gods, for example. But although they recognized their existence, do you think they attributed the same, let's say, properties to these gods, like omniscience, for example, a super perception?
Yeah.
Or is there a degree of a kind of hierarchy in this situation?
I feel like you've answered your own question very well there.
You do?
I think there are two possibilities. There's many different possibilities. We're talking about a religion that didn't have a canon, in which, if you said, John McKinnell describes this very well in both One and Many. If you're reciting a poem to Thor, it could be that somebody comes up to you afterwards and has a disagreement with you about the poem. But that doesn't mean that other perspectives on even something like Thor's fishing trip, for example, that doesn't mean that those perspectives weren't equally valid. So this is a religion in which there probably is a lot of fluidity of ideas, in which they could take in ideas from outside. And I think we have a lot of evidence of ideas coming from outside, from the Sami religion, for example. But you do point out that there's also an otherness there. There's linguistic boundaries, cultural boundaries between these two people, and that almost certainly affects the way in which ideas were transmitted between them and the kind of valuation of those ideas. I love the studies that look at the giants, the Jutnar, as a kind of manifestation of the Sami, of the other, and that's probably relevant here in terms of how we should consider, if not that idea to be correct, at least how we should consider the relationship between these people, and maybe the inverse would be true as well. We also might look at the study of the Mayan creatures, supernatural creatures earlier, the Christian god being given this particular level of super knowledge, and then the sun and the masters of the forest, and then the supposed bogeymen at the bottom. The hierarchies are definitely possible. And presumably, the hierarchy, the way in which you value another person's god, is related to the hierarchy in which the hierarchy of your relationship with that person. I think there's almost certainly studies of this, and anthropology, and that would be the first place I go to answer this question. I think properly answer this question rather than this kind of debate. This debate of the different possibilities that I've given instead.
Indeed.
It's fascinating. Thank you.
I think so too. Thank you, Declan. So, well, I guess we must end our debate now. I'm sorry, we're running out of time. Let me express you on behalf of all the group and of all the audience. Thank you for accepting our invitation, for being here, preparing this very special conference, very original, and for answering so kindly our questions and starting this small debate. So thank you for being part of our first digital conference, and I hope this is just the first of many others to come in the future. So thank you.
Thank you as well. This has been fantastic, and I've loved the whole conference, everything. Thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear. Thank you. So I'm just taking some time now to close the event in Portuguese, let the audience know about this is the last conference and such.
Fantastic.
Pessoal, obrigado a todos pela presença, pela audiência. Então, chegamos ao fim da nossa última conferência do primeiro evento digital em mitologia nórdica. Em nome do Neve, gostaria de agradecer a todos pela presença, pelo engajamento, pela divulgação, quem ajudou com a divulgação, e a quem participou, assistiu, e esperamos que esse seja o primeiro de uma série de eventos presenciais, continuando, né, se ano que vem for possível, continuaremos com o SEV presencial, caso não, continuando em alguma plataforma digital, de alguma maneira. Então, gostaríamos de agradecer a todos, e esperamos que nossas conferências e as falas dos nossos palestrantes tenham contribuído, tenham acrescentado e despertado interesses e vontade de debate, enfim, tenham chamado vocês a esse campo de pesquisa maravilhoso que é a escandinavística. Então, a todos, nós agradecemos. Muito obrigado. Thank you, Declan.
Thank you.